So, next talk, Sharon's going to come and speak on Am I Just My Brain? So thank you, Sharon. Come and join us. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. And wonderful to join you back for the afternoon to think about whether or not we are our neurons in our heads entirely. I suppose the spoiler alert is the answer to that is no, in case you're wondering. But I'll say a little bit more during this talk as to why that is the case. And Phil has already mentioned that everything that I say in here and more is already in a book of the same topic. I have an early childhood memory of being sat by a window on a rainy day. I think it was a Sunday. I think I was around, I don't know, somewhere between the ages of 9 and 12. And I remember being slightly bored and just watching the rain kind of splash against the window. And suddenly a series of questions came into my head. Why can I think? Why do I exist? Why am I a living, breathing, conscious being who experiences life? I had an awareness of my own consciousness, if you like. And I wasn't actually raised in a religious home. Part of my journey is that I became a Christian as an adult at university. I might say a bit more about that, or you could ask me about it in the Q&A as well. But those questions in me just seemed to come from nowhere. They were potentially unprompted because I was slightly bored and phones weren't available at that point in history. But nevertheless, conscious awareness seems to be central to what it means to be a human being. But what is a human being? The question, am I just my brain, asks a question of identity. What are we? Are we advanced apes? Are we just machines? Are we souls trapped in a body that one day will float off to heaven? Are we just physical beings? Or is there more to it? I'm just going to move this down a bit. I think it's a bit echoey. Now, today, if we were to ask you what it is that makes you you, what is the central, most important thing about you, we might receive a range of different answers. Some people might say, well, the thing that makes me me is my relationships, my community, my family. Some people might say, well, the thing that makes me me is my experiences, good and bad. These have shaped me and formed me into the person that I am today. Now, other people might say, the thing that makes me me is my career, my purpose in the world, my influence. And what we want to look at in this lecture is the line of thought that says, look, the central thing that makes you, you, is your brain. Your brain defines you. The choices that you make, good or bad, the personality that you have, the behaviors that you exhibit, even the religious beliefs that you may have, they're all dictated by the activity in your brain. So we want to look at that view. And of course, we live in an age in which neuroscience has grown exponentially. It is uncovering more and more about the structure and function of the human brain. I had the massive privilege of spending over 10 years in the field of functional MRI, where we use magnetic resonance imaging to look inside the brains of healthy people for the purposes of research. And we can look at all kinds of networks that are activated in response to giving people a particular task to do in an MRI scanner. And I was involved in that for over 10 years. Brain imaging is being used to look at all kinds of things. We've moved on from the Human Genome Project. Neuroscientists have embarked on the Human Connectome Project, which is an attempt to understand the connection between every neural pathway in the brain and how it varies between people. And this is a mind-boggling goal, really, to even contemplate. Of course, the whole area of brain imaging, there are many different kinds, but it has been extended into looking into what happens in the brain during different kinds of religious activity, what happens in the brain when we pray. And you'll be relieved to know that things happen in the brain when you pray. This is not something that we need to be afraid of as Christians. And there's lots that we could say about that. It's an area known as neurotheology, the area in which neuroscience intersects with theology. But do these discoveries of neuroscience, which are beautiful and elegant, do they mean that everything that it is to be a human being can be explained entirely in terms of brain chemistry and electrical activity? After all, some brilliant scientists believe this. You'll probably be familiar with Francis Crick as someone who co-discovered the DNA double helix and won the joint Nobel Prize along with James Watson in the 1960s. Well, Crick went on to write another book in 1994, The Astonishing Hypothesis, in which he said this. He said, "You, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. As Lewis Carroll might have phrased it, you're nothing but a pack of neurons." How do you feel about this? Is it true that you are just a pack of neurons? Is this the best story that can be told about human identity? There are all kinds of implications of this view, not least for AI. If human consciousness, if the human brain is a machine, then human consciousness is also material, and therefore, in theory, one day it could be generated artificially. The answer that you give to the question, am I just my brain, impacts the answer to the question that you would give, will there one day be conscious androids walking the streets of Portsmouth? And so this is not simply a question for neuroscientists and philosophers. This is actually a question that affects all of us in all kinds of different ways. Now, an important part of how we respond to this as Christians is to say that it's actually not enough to simply talk about the brain. Humans also have a mind, and the mind and brain are connected. So there are two different things at play. There is the brain with all of its cells and electrical activity and synapses and chemicals and neurotransmitters and so on. And then there is the mind with all of its thoughts and feelings and emotions and memories. You see, in addition to a brain, you have an inner world. You have an inner reality. You have a unique first-person perspective on the world. And as the philosopher Thomas Nagel once put it, there is something that it is like to be you. You are a conscious being. And the key question that lies at the heart of this conversation is, what is the relationship between neurons and what it's like to be you? How do you get from one to the other? Now, the impression can sometimes be that now that we have neuroscience and brain imaging techniques, suddenly the philosophers and theologians are scrabbling around for answers to this question. But this is actually an ancient question. It has been debated since the ancient world. Perhaps then it was the body-soul question. Now it is the mind-brain problem, but it is not a new question. How do you get from brain chemistry to what it's like to be you, or all the questions that are going on in your stream of consciousness, if you like? Flat white or cappuccino next time you go to Costa Coffee. Or as Susan Greenfield, Professor of Physiology at the University of Oxford, put it, and listen to her language, she is not a Christian. How does the water of boring old brain cells and sludgy stuff translate into the wine of phenomenological subjective experience? How do you get from water to wine? And how you get from brain reactions to what it's like to be you has occupied philosophers and scientists for centuries. And there are many today that agree that this is a hard problem to solve. This is not a done deal. This is not been sorted out conclusively. This is actually a hard problem to solve. So much so that philosopher David Chalmers of NYU, Australian philosopher, named it the hard problem of consciousness. And he distinguishes between easy problems and hard problems. Easy problems are problems to do with looking at the areas of your brain that are turned on and off when you move from one state of consciousness to another. For example, moving from a state of being awake to being asleep, and I hope that there are no altered states of consciousness taking place at this point. But that will be considered looking at easy problems. Now, easy problems are not easy. In fact, whole lifetimes of research are taken up studying them. But Chalmers, again, not a Christian, makes the point that compared to the hard problem, they are trivial, because the hard problem concerns how on earth you get from brain processes to what it is like to be you. And I guess the perspective driving this, the perspective that says you are your brain, is essentially saying that mind and brain are the same thing. It's saying that mental states are brain states. Mental processes are brain processes. Which is kind of another way of saying there isn't really anything that it is like to be you. There's just brain processes. But surely this is an absurd way of thinking about human beings. For a start, it's incoherent. If you think about it, if somebody wants to express that view, they're basically saying, my first-person perspective on the world is that there is no first-person perspective on the world. It very quickly collapses into incoherence. Secondly, we do not and cannot live without assuming that there is something it is like to be us. Our bookshops are full of autobiographies describing people's first-person experiences in life. We all now have a first-person perspective on what COVID-19 was like. Even mindfulness experts tell us to focus on this inner self for a better state of well-being. And of course, we treat other people as though they are conscious beings as well. As we've already said, the fact that we experience outrage and get passionate about matters of justice is because we believe people are not merely packs of neurons, but conscious beings who experience suffering. And so this is all to say that chalking it all down to brain chemicals doesn't seem to be enough. What the science has shown us is that mind and brain are connected. If you put someone in an MRI scanner and get them to use a task that uses their mind, you see brain networks activated. The mind and the brain are connected. But the error that's often made is to say just because they're connected does not mean they are identical. Let me try and show you a little bit more about why that is the case. Perhaps you've had one of these today. I've had, several. Imagine we did live in an entirely material universe, and all you have is physical descriptions. Describe to me the smell of coffee. Now, you might offer me the chemical structure of caffeine, and that would be very interesting. But that doesn't actually get me any closer to the smell of coffee. Or you might describe the physiology as I drink the coffee and digest it, as the caffeine starts to kind of have a stimulatory effect on my system. And that would be very interesting. But it doesn't get me any closer to the smell of coffee. If you want to understand the smell of coffee, what do you need to do? Smell it. There's actually no other way to access that experience, that phenomenon. And this is an example of a quale in its singular or the plural, qualia. Philosophers talk about qualia as being qualitative experiences that are impossible to describe physically. Other examples include tasting something or seeing a colour. Life is full of qualia. We're encountering them all the time. And the biggest qualia of all is the experience of what it is to be you. Just putting it one more way, just to make sure we all kind of get this concept. Imagine we wanted to do an experiment to find out what it's like for you to revise for your next set of exams or go through an audit at work. And we collect data from your brain using EEG, using functional MRI, using structural MRI. Will that tell us what it's like for you to go through that process? No. It will give us some interesting data from your brain, but that doesn't tell us what it's like for you. And so brain processes and human experience are two very different things. Brains don't think. People think using their brains. And there are actually many other ways of describing the mind-brain relationship that I don't have time to go into today, but I do talk about in my book. And there are views that agnostics and atheists subscribe to as well that offer a much more holistic way of thinking about human beings. One thing that it's really important to say on this topic is that we are seeing people kind of draw conclusions that go far beyond what the data actually tell us in this field. I use this as an example. In 2017, one of the front covers of Scientific American had this very enticing title, How the Mind Arises. Ooh, tell me more. What have you discovered? And of course, the subtitle underneath that says, Network interactions in the brain create thought. Now, let me ask the scientists among you, is there a scientific study that you can do that will tell you that network interactions in the brain create thought? Is that a scientific statement or is it a philosophical statement? It's a philosophical statement that rests on the assumption that the brain generates consciousness, that the brain generates the thoughts, but the data doesn't get you there. The data gets you to network interactions in the brain correlate with thought. It doesn't get you to creation. That's a philosophical belief that has been imposed on the data, published in a scientific journal with the appearance of being a scientific conclusion. We see this all the time. And as Christians and apologists, we need to develop the skill of seeing where has a boundary been crossed from science to philosophy that goes actually quite far beyond what the data can actually tell you. So let's develop the skill of doing that. There's actually a lot as well in clinical neuroscience that indicates that humans are far more complex than simply their brains. A number of examples could be given. One such as there are some adults that have recovered from childhood hydrancephaly, which is water on the brain, and they're actually missing 95% of their brain tissue. 95%. You put them in an MRI scanner, ain't a lot there. And yet they are functioning normally as adults. And so what do you do with this kind of data? If we are just our brains, how do you make sense of adults with 95% of their brain tissue missing and yet are functioning normally? You ought not to see that. There's also a very interesting data set that's been around since the 1970s, since we've developed the ability to resuscitate people from a state of clinical death back to being alive again, that patients began to report being conscious during the period where they were in cardiac arrest with no detectable heart signal, no brain signal at that point either. And actually a vast body of data has been collected. There's a journal of near-death studies. There's a handbook of near-death experiences documenting the first 30 years of research. Fascinating data set. Obviously, you know, there are various questions we want to ask. But when somebody that was a strict physicalist comes to change their position on what a human being is based on their own near-death experience, that perhaps gives us pause for thought. And so one such person is Dr. Eben Alexander, who was a former Harvard neurosurgeon. Before his own experience, he believed that if you don't have a working brain, you cannot be conscious. Until he himself developed severe bacterial meningitis at the age of 54, was in a coma for 7 days. Family were told to put their affairs in order. He wasn't expected to survive, and yet extraordinarily he did. And recounts an extremely vivid experience whilst his entire neocortex had been shut down. And he said this: "My experience showed me that the death of the body and the brain are not the end of consciousness, that human experience continues beyond the grave." Gives you pause for thought when it's actually quite unpopular to hold that kind of view in that kind of setting, let alone change your mind from being a physicalist to someone that actually believes there's more to being a human being than just their brain. We could also talk about moments of lucidity in patients with severe dementia or Alzheimer's, despite having very severe degeneration of their brain. I even have a story from my own family of that incidents. And so when we seek to answer questions of human identity, we need to take into account the full scope of human experience and clinical observation, because what we see in the clinic is human beings are complex. And we can't simply look at them through this one lens of the brain and say, yeah, that's everything that it is to be a human being. So much more to being a human being than just your brain. Very briefly, in conclusion, even if all of our questions about the scientific workings of the mind and the brain became answered, even if we could fully describe the nature of the relationship between mind and brain, that would still leave some questions unanswered. Questions like the ones I found myself asking seemingly from nowhere as a 10-year-old with no religious background. Why can I think at all? Why do I exist? Why are we conscious beings in the first place? And as David Chalmers said once, there is a difference between finding a correlate and finding an explanation. What is the best explanation for why we find ourselves in this universe as conscious beings? You see, if God doesn't exist, then human consciousness has arisen out of a non-conscious universe of time plus matter plus chance. And again, it's not impossible, but it's somewhat surprising. But if God does exist, then if you like, conscious beings are exactly what we might expect, because we started with a conscious being known as God. If God exists, then consciousness is fundamental to the universe, because before there was anything material, there was God. A conscious being in a conscious community of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And we see this in the very first sentence of the Bible. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And of course, in the opening chapter of John's Gospel, that through him, through the Logos, all things were made, including the human brain. And as George Wald, Nobel laureate in physiology and medicine, put it, He said, mind, rather than emerging as a late outgrowth in the evolution of life, has existed always as the matrix, the source and condition of physical reality. That the stuff of which physical reality is constructed is mind stuff. It is mind that has composed a physical universe. If it's true that God exists, which you and I believe it is, then we have grounds for making sense of why we can think at all. And there is hope for solving the hard problem of consciousness, because we didn't start with matter. We started with a conscious being known as God. And this same God has made us in his image. And so why can we think? Well, we can think because God thinks. We have a mind because God has a mind. Which means that right at the heart of what it means to be a Christian is to be a thinker. Not just as an extra add-on for those that are a bit intellectual, but actually as a reflection of being made in the image of God. And if it's true that we're made in the image of God, it also means that there's an identity to us that runs far deeper than the activity of our brains. And if the condition of our body and brain changes, our value and our worth before God does not change. All human beings are made by God, known by him, and have the capacity to know God precisely because they are conscious beings as well. It's the very mind that we're given that enables us to contemplate God and come to know him as well. And because that is true, there is hope for us all. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, Sharon. That's really just fascinating. Thank you for that. And do, if you're more interested in some of these things, Sharon will unpack it more in her book, Am I Just My Brain, which you can buy at the book tables. Really recommend that to you. There's only a few copies left, so do grab hold of those.